Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you all for coming back to the exciting panel of accessibility. I'm Tom Hicks, Vice Chair of the Election Assistance Commission, and on my panel today you'll see two people. The third is coming, and the fourth is also coming. So I'm going to introduce the folks who are here. So to my left, Virginia Atkinson is the Senior Accessible and Inclusion Specialist at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. She has more than a decade of experience working on disability rights, advocacy, and governance issues. At IFAS, Virginia provides technical assistance and training to civil society organizations and election management bodies. She is also the lead author of the manual Equal Access: How to Include Persons with Disabilities in Elections and Political Processes. On my right is Stafford Ward. He's Secretary of the Board of the Overseas Vote Foundation, as well as Technology and Voting Systems Advisor. The foundation provides U.S. citizens with voting services and election data central to the missions. You're on this side. You're over here. Your stuff's there. Yep. In elections, we just roll with it. So central to that mission is the foundation's work to provide online tools to assist Americans living anywhere in the world, including those living abroad and serving in the military, to register to vote and request their absentee ballots. Stafford plays a lead role in shaping the foundation's strategy, civic technology initiatives, and works to ensure voters have easy access to information they need to participate in democracy from all corners of the world. And Michelle Bishop is a voting rights specialist with the National Disability Rights Network, a position she has held for nearly 5 years. Michelle provides training and technical assistance regarding voting rights accessible for voters with disabilities. She also coordinates the voting working group and manages their listserv. And last but not least, I'm going to introduce him because he's on his way, is Cameron Sasnett. He is the Director of Office of Elections and General Register for Fairfax County, the largest county in Virginia, which is the state's most populous county. He oversees the operations and staff to coordinate voting registration and election initiatives for the county's 750,000 voters and 243 election precincts. During his time as director, Cameron has expanded the county's election language access and successful story he shared with us last summer at our language summit here in DC. We look forward to his continued conversation today when he arrives. So with that, I would start with Michelle to talk about disability access.
Absolutely. Am I good? Okay. Hi, I'm Michelle Bishop, and I like to make an entrance. So I'm always fashionably late, but I'd also like to thank Cameron for being later than I today.
Come on up.
Something that I will basically never live down from Commissioner Hicks. So thank you for having me this afternoon, first and foremost, to the EAC. I'm happy to be here to talk a little bit about disability voter access and what we're looking towards in the 2018 election cycle. And with National Disability Rights Network, or NDRN, we're actually a national network of disability rights organizations. So there is an organization of ours in every state, district, and territory in the United States. Wherever you are, we're there. And we're actually mandated by HAVA to work on access to the vote for people with disabilities. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, to talk about the things you really came to hear, I think what really sums up what we're looking at in terms of access to the vote for people with disabilities is the most recent report to come out of the U.S. Government Accountability Office on polling place access. They've actually surveyed polling place access in 2000, 2008, and 2016. And that's been kind of our best benchmark as to where we're at. And I think this most recent report from 2016 is really telling, because what we found is that the polling place itself, that path of travel from parking all the way up to the voting booth, has consistently improved in terms of accessibility. The first time this was studied in 2000, only 16%, as in less than 20%, of polling places were fully accessible. In 2008, it went up to 27%. In 2016, 40% were fully accessible. Now, that probably sounds bad. That means that less than half of polling places are still fully accessible. The sad thing is when I read that number, I was excited. So that tells you where our expectations are at right now, because it's less than half, but I thought the number is still going in the right direction and I'm going to take that win for right now. So I will say, although progress has been slow for many reasons, least of which is lack of funding, progress has been slow. We're moving in the right direction. I think, to me, the number that's more telling is that since 2008, GAO has also been looking at the accessibility of the voting booth itself, that actual voting station. And in 2008, they found that 46% of them were not fully accessible. 46% of voting stations themselves had some type of impediment for people with disabilities. In 2016, that number actually went up. 65% were in some way inaccessible. We're going in the wrong direction when it comes to how we're actually casting our ballots. And this means that they were less likely to be wheelchair accessible, less likely to be set up to ensure voter privacy, less likely to have readily apparent headphones for people who need an audio ballot, who can't read a page or a screen, and, interestingly enough, less likely to even be powered on. We're setting out voting machines that we're not even bothering to switch on. And there are two, I think, in my mind, main reasons for that. What changed between 2008 and 2016? And I'll say the first thing that I think we've talked a lot about today is the funding issue. When HAVA passed, the federal government was willing to put money into the states to get this equipment that we need to make this happen. And that money has not been replaced. And states and local jurisdictions desperately need funding to be able to maintain or update that equipment. And it sorely needs to be updated because the machines that we're using were invented before iPads and iPhones. And so they themselves are severely out of date. But the funding's not there to make those changes. So we're working with equipment that's less than ideal. I think the other major thing that's also been a real focal point today is the security issue. And I think that it's important. I think we need elections that are secure and accurate, and I think that we all know that. But the main solution to the security issue has been returning to a hand-marked paper ballot. This has been the primary solution that's been offered for all of our cybersecurity concerns, which means we went back to polling places where we're mostly setting up folding tables with a stack of ballots and a pen. And we have one piece of accessible equipment for anyone who can't do that. And we're not even bothering to power it on. Because for some reason, when we talk about voting security, we all get very, very comfortable with segregation. Anyone who can hand mark this paper ballot will do that. And anyone else can go use the special machine over here in the corner that the special people use. And anytime we segregate out how we're casting our ballots, we start to see inequality. There's one lesson I think we've learned in this country, it should be that separate is not equal. And so we're seeing a decline in the accessibility of the voting booth itself. And I think we're going to continue to see that until we start proposing real solutions that are both secure and accessible, and until we're willing to fund them, and particularly fund some of the research and development we need to make those things possible, because that technology didn't exist when we first went through this 15 years ago, and we were having the same argument. But that technology, it exists today. We just need to learn how to leverage it in a way that's going to be efficient and affordable for our elections authorities. So I think that there are real solutions. We're just not really talking about them, and we're not really working together to find them. The last thing I think is that what we're looking at in 2018 is that we're changing how we vote. All of a sudden, people are registering to vote online. Or maybe you're being mailed a ballot and you have options for how you want to return it. I think that's amazing. I think voters expect those options. I think it makes it easier for our elections officials to manage. I think it makes it easier for the voter to manage the process, but I think those options all need to be accessible. And they are to varying degrees. Like everything else with elections, we all do it differently. Every state, every locality does it differently. And the extent to which we're talking to people with disabilities throughout that process to make sure that it's accessible determines how accessible those systems really become. Are we talking to people with disabilities when we're thinking about doing this and as we're developing it and when we roll it out? Or are we creating new voting equipment and asking people with disabilities after what they think about it? Are we purchasing new systems and implementing them and then asking people with disabilities how great they are when we never ask them, will this work for you in the first place? And I think the solution to all those things are rather simple. It's that we have to be collaborating, we have to be working together. We talked a lot today about all of the expectations of our elections authorities, right? It's not enough to be an expert in elections. Now you have to understand queuing theory and how to shorten the lines, and you have to be an IT expert and a cybersecurity expert, and no blockchain came up. I'm so happy, because then no no one defined it, right? I bet you half the people in this room don't know what blockchain is. And you have to be an expert in all these things, and that's unrealistic and that's unfair. The good news is it's also faulty logic. You don't have to be an expert in all those things. You just have to know who to talk to. And there are disability rights organizations in every state and in every district and every territory that are federally mandated to work on this, whether we're talking to them or not. So we might as well be working together, and I think that we could solve a lot of these issues. But that's a lot of what we're looking at coming in 2018.
Okay. Well, thank you. We really appreciate that. One of the questions that we'll have later on is how can groups like yours work with election officials to move the ball forward? Okay. So with that, Cameron, we're going to go to you, and the premise is that we are giving 5-minute presentations, okay, and then we're going to be I'm going to be asking questions.
Well, considering my tardiness, I will try and limit my 5 minutes, and so I do have to thank you for allowing me the opportunity to be the award winner for the fashionably late entry, but well, being the moderator, I think you would have that privilege, but I can tell you it's a wonderful experience being literally trapped on an on-ramp on I-66. So for those of you from out of town or that you will be visiting DC in the future, avoid 66 as much as possible. That is the one place where, as you're talking about lines for elections, I think that's we can build some pretty fantastic lines off there. In terms of the local administration for elections, I couldn't agree more with a lot of what you said in regards to looking holistically at the approach for our voters. Here in Virginia, one of the things that we had a fantastic opportunity, and probably y'all may have seen on the news around the country, is that we had some very close elections. And we had those close elections. It goes down to recount. Recount reveals a lot of paper ballots in which you get to finally see how voters are actually interacting with these things. Not in a simulated environment, not in a test environment, but in the real world, real election environment. It comes down to, did the person fill out the bubble right? And for those of you who have done recounts on elections, those of you who have done audits and looked at all your ballots, you know that it's not as simple as fill in that bubble and that directions that they follow. So I get to think, what happens when somebody who may not be able to hold a pen correctly, what happens in that person who does not have the ability to actually understand fill in the bubble? What options do they have, and are they that willing to go over, like you said, to ask for that one machine that might be there? A few years back, I was really offended when I walked into one of my polling places, and my teams had actually put up a handicap sign on the ADA device, and tried explaining to them it's not for somebody who is physically disabled necessarily. It's for somebody who might have a visual disability. It's for somebody who might have a cognitive disability that allows them to interact. And I think that's the approach that we try and take here in Fairfax County, is that making our election officers understand that that's the way that it needs to be. It's not necessarily somebody rolling up in a wheelchair or who might be using canes. And so getting that idea into 5,000 election officers' head at the same time, that they do in fact need more than just pull it out of the bag and turn, but they need to turn it on. They need to understand that it needs to have all the accessories able and ready to go with it, so that every voter that walks in has the ability to. One of the things that I want to look towards is leveling the voting experience for everybody. And so as new equipment comes out that is more reminiscent of the DRE style, that prevents things like overvotes and makes sure that voters who have language barriers have that opportunity no matter what their language is, and getting and using those ADA devices as actual full polling devices for everybody, so that regardless of what the voters' disabilities or limitations might be, they're voting the exact same way and the exact same method as every voter who cast a ballot. And ultimately, at the end of the day, winds up with the exact same types of ballots, so that we're not sitting here debating back and forth and having a 3-judge panel decide if an extra line that somebody drew through a name constitutes I wanted that voter or I wanted that candidate or not. And so I think those are the sort of paths that we can go down towards, but those are decisions that we do have to make as administrators. I have to be the one pounding the drum at the General Assembly saying we need more money, because otherwise we're going to wind up seeing situations like this. And if we don't have the tools and resources for the voters, we're going to continue to have essentially what amounts to contested elections because we will have ink all over these paper ballots. And so I think minimizing that and getting those resources is one of the things that I look at locally, especially as of just a little bit ago, our General Assembly here in Virginia just began.
Stafford.
Thank you, Tom, for inviting me to this panel. And just quickly, I want to make a special acknowledgement to my wife. Happy anniversary. I have a slightly different take on accessibility, different from what the other panelists here today. The goal for my presentation here today is to change a narrative on absentee voting and overseas voting. And what do I mean by that? Gone are the days that we had, ballot issues that were prior to the Uniform and Overseas Sitting and Absentee Voting Act of August 28, 1986, where the ballot was difficult to be reached to voters overseas, ballots were received on time, citizens who had the inability to vote from overseas. The U.S. Vote Foundation sees itself as we're in an inflection point in terms of, with regard to policy challenges that we still see for overseas voters in terms of accessibility. One being overseas voters who may have lived overseas for 20 plus years still will have to file their absentee ballot every year. They have tax implications for those living overseas, depending on the state in which they live, have that hurdle to overcome. States who have American citizens who are born overseas may not have the ability to vote from overseas. If you look at the overall overseas voting turnout rate, it's at 4%. I think of my colleague here at the Federal Voting Assistance Program with a report to Congress in 2016. It is a 4% rate. And just this morning, Doug Chapman mentioned the U.S. Supreme Court oral arguments with Houston versus A. Philip Randolph Institute, where which was taking a ruling on how Ohio implements the National Voter Registration Act. And in that case, there's an example of a military voter who served 15 years in Iraq, 4 years in Afghanistan, and he was thrown off the rolls in 2011 simply because he didn't elect in consecutive election cycles, and that was the reason why he was taken off the rolls. But this is part of the narrative that I'm talking about that needs to be that's changing, and that we're focused on the U.S. Vote Foundation. So I just want to get to 3 points that I want to identify in my remarks here. One is I just want to explain, who is the U.S. Vote Foundation. Two, I want to address more about accessibility and technology that we are utilizing. And three, to talk about the participation that we have with election officials across the country. I know, Tom, you mentioned that was part of the Overseas Vote Foundation, but we are no longer known as that. We are known as the U.S. Vote Foundation. In 2004, we were known as the Overseas Vote Foundation. That was established by our President and CEO, Susan Dragowska-Sweenot. At the time, she saw the need for having greater access for those living overseas, consistent with the UOCAVA Act. So we're not an advocacy group. We are a nonpartisan, non-political organization that serves U.S. citizens living domestically and abroad to access the ballot and to register to vote. As part of that same year, in 2004, we were the first to automate the federal write-in absentee ballot, part of Section 103 of the UOCAVA Act. We were there to make sure that these elements were in place so that U.S. citizens living overseas, no matter where they lived, had access to the ballot. This part of our mission and vision is that every citizen is a voter. And what that means is basically ensuring that every citizen has access to voter information as part of their engagement with democracy and civic life as voting as their central action. So the U.S. Vote Foundation uses and deploys civic technology to make the voting process easier for both U.S. voters and election administrators across the country. So how do we go about doing that? So my next point leading into accessibility is some of the reforms we've seen with the UOCAVA Act, of course, came with the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act of 2009. That helped to facilitate and expand the rights of voter rights overseas for U.S. citizens. That has enabled us, the U.S. Vote Foundation, to leverage that passage of the act so we can increase accessibility for those U.S. citizens living overseas. And again, this is part of the narrative that we're changing to discard of the old notions of what it meant to vote from overseas to what it is now, and in terms of how we're using civic technology to address accessibility issues for voters overseas. We use industry standards In terms of technology, like JavaScript, object notation, XML, Python, high-level programming languages, some of the things that are out there in the innovation of civic technology to develop our back-end databases so that they are available to our state officials, local officials, and third-party organizations. Some of the services that we do provide to harness in accessibilities, we develop custom websites and hosted system solutions for states. We have election official data. We collect data from all election officials across the country, and we have a civic data API, or application programming interface. And basically that helps push the information that we collect to our users and to our licensees so they can best use the information at their leisure. So because we are a civic technology organization, we are very, very serious about providing high quality curated data and data that is protected. We are very serious about data privacy, as it was noted in the previous panel about the importance of securing voter information. I think that was something Doug Chapman mentioned at the top of his remarks earlier. So that leads into our partnerships and our relationships with election officials across the country. That being, with state election officials and local election officials, as I mentioned earlier, through our hosted hosted system solutions, and our election official data through our data curating. And keep in mind, the information that we get from election officials, they control that information. They control the information that they send us. And it's the most accurate and most up-to-date information that every U.S. citizen, domestically and overseas, can access. So they are aware of the state voter requirements. They're aware of election dates and deadlines. They're aware of voter registration deadlines. They're aware of their absentee ballot request policies. Because every state is different. I went through reviewing every 50 state and U.S. territory, reviewing the absentee ballot policies. They range from, they have a legitimate, straightforward standard form, or it's basically you have to email a county jurisdiction from where you vote regularly. So I say that because they're nice to have widgets here and automated tools there, but it's about the human interactions and the trust that we build with election officials, right? So you're not going to leave me hanging?
Oh. I thought you were just pointing at me.
So we're here to provide the best information available to our U.S. voters here and overseas, and and everybody, most of the people in this room well knows that elections is a year-round effort. It's not a twice a year, 3 times a year thing. It's every year. I noted that Krisha Gogorowicz noted earlier that there are 178,000 voting precincts. We have a team at U.S. Vote that combs every single election across the country and try to get as much information about that precinct and when they have their election dates and deadlines and that type of thing. And we harness that information, we collect that information, and we provide it for our user base and for state and election officials and our third-party organizations, and when we license them out as part of our service. So I'll close out by saying, we use civic technology as an example of addressing accessibility for U.S. citizens overseas. And civic technology is inexpensive, it's available, it's reliable, and it's proven to work, given that we have quite a number of clients that we have that are using our services to make sure that every citizen that wants to vote, desires to vote, can vote, no matter wherever they are in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Stafford. And I apologize for calling it Overseas Vote Foundation, because I know that Susan's probably emailing me right now. But I've worked with Susan for a number of years, and she did change. The organization has been called the U.S. Vote Foundation for a while now. But lastly, Virginia, we wanted to have a perspective of listening to the domestic part of this, and then you and Stafford coming in and talking about how it affects folks overseas. But you're mostly focused in on organizations overseas and their processes. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yep, definitely. Okay. Thanks, Tom. So my name is Virginia. I'm from the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. So we're a US-based international nonprofit organization. We work on issues related to democracy and governance in countries all around the world. Every region, you name it, we're probably there right now or have been recently. As part of that, our main partners are the Election Commission and civil society groups in that country. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the 4 main barriers that people with disabilities encounter, I'd say both here in the US as well as globally, My role at IFIS is to make sure that all of the work that we're doing supporting election commissions and working with civil society groups is inclusive of people with disabilities. So I think the first thing to start off to say is that being American, we're an international, neutral, nonprofit organization. But being American, of course, and being based here in DC, one of the first questions that I'm often asked is about the US process. So what happens here is of interest abroad and does have an impact in particular on election commissioners in terms of trying to persuade them to be more inclusive in the work that they're doing. So to that end, though, there's still numerous barriers that people with disabilities encounter, I'd say even more so abroad. There's 4 kind of main areas that those fall into. First one being most obvious, I think, physical barriers. Next, related to information. So people with disabilities don't usually receive information in accessible formats about where to go to vote, how to mark the ballot, or even who to vote for. What are the political party policy platforms? Who are the candidates that are running? How do they differ from each other? The third barrier is related to stigma. In particular, in many countries around the world where we're working, there's a huge stigma with having a disability. And a big part of that is sort of discrimination, but a lot of it is also historical beliefs in that country of, maybe your ancestor did something wrong and this is why your child was born with a disability. There's a lot of misplaced myths and stereotypes around disability in the places where we're working. And then the last barrier that people with disabilities encounter is related to legal and policy barriers. So election commissions aren't responsible for changing the law, but there's a lot that they can do that's within policy reform, that is within their purview. So under the guise of those sort of 4 main barriers, the first one being physical, as Michelle mentioned, there is a lot of progress here in the US on that issue. And I'd say that in many of the countries where we work, I think everyone looks to us as sort of the gold standard in terms of physical access. That said, there are innovative and unique things happening in other countries that I'm sure would be of interest here. One in particular in the Philippines. So there, just like here, most of the polling stations are held in schools. However, many schools, majority of schools there, are not physically accessible. So the disability community, along with IFIS, when we were working with the Election Commission ahead of their 2012 presidential election, they had a great idea. They suggested, why can't we vote in the shopping malls? The shopping malls are some of the most accessible buildings in most countries. Companies want to make sure they get their money from everyone. So what the Election Commission did is they signed an MOU with SM Malls, which is one of the biggest chains there. They did a pilot in Manila, in the capital, and people with disabilities were registering to vote outside the Burger King. And this was something that was really popular. They've now expanded it across the whole country, so people with disabilities are able to register in shopping malls nationwide now. And as you can imagine as well, the general public is like, hey, I also would like to register to vote in the shopping mall. This is much more convenient. And they are now expanding it, and they're doing some pilots of voting in the shopping malls as well. And right now, that's something that's specifically for citizens with disabilities. Another area that I mentioned is related to information. So something that's, I think, one of the most marginalized groups within the disability community is people with intellectual disabilities. They're often left out in terms of being included in the political process or even thinking that they would want to participate, where many people with intellectual disabilities are very interested. They have jobs, they're paying taxes, they'd also like to vote. So something that the New Zealand Election Commission did is produce a DVD specifically targeting people with intellectual disabilities. That has people with intellectual disabilities telling the story of how to go to vote, where to go, what to do if you have a question. And it's all in very simple, easy to understand language. And this was, again, something that came about through a partnership with the Election Commission working directly with the disability community there. One of the other barriers that I mentioned was related to attitude and stigma. So something that happened in the Dominican Republic, the Election Commission there actually has their own TV channel. So for about the 3 months before the elections, there's an entire TV channel that's all-day elections, everything related to the electoral process. So they worked together with the disability community to produce a video that was specifically, the point of it was to target this stigma. It showed people with disabilities in their jobs, showed people with disabilities pledging allegiance to the flag, singing the national anthem. Dominicans, like Americans, are very patriotic. And so these images of, the national anthem and the flag in the background really appealed to the public there. And this was something that the disability community specifically asked the commission to do because they were getting pushback from their family members. You know, when they said to their family they'd like to go out and vote, can you help me get to the polling station? Many times their family members are the ones that were saying, oh, why do you want to worry about that? Why are you interested in this? You know, it doesn't concern you. And so this was something that the Election Commission did in partnership with the disability community to specifically address this #1 issue that was raised by the disability community there. Then the last barrier I mentioned was related to legal and policy barriers. Policy, as I said, is something that's within the remit of the Election Commission and something that they can change. In Guatemala, I have the poll worker training manual here. And in their poll worker training manual, they have how to do the alphabet in sign language, as well as how to say hello, goodbye, and thank you in sign language. So all of the poll workers in Guatemala for the past 2 national level election cycles have learned basic sign language. And this is something, in addition to people with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities, the deaf community is also usually incredibly marginalized in terms of receiving information and feeling welcome at the polls. So this was something that made a big impact there. The last thing I'd like to just briefly talk about is we find that people with disabilities that also or identify with a different marginalized group, so say like you're a woman with a disability, you're from an ethnic or religious minority and you have a disability, you know, you're a young person with a disability, the barriers are compounded for people that have these multiple forms of identity, that identify with these different groups. So a lot of the work that IFAS does is working with election commissions and groups representing different parts of society to develop information campaigns that are inclusive. So I have a little mini poster here that was made in Kenya for their elections last August. The Election Commission developed a campaign specifically targeting youth called Why Vote? And as part of that campaign, they integrated images of young people with disabilities. So this one shows a young man who's blind at the polling station casting his ballot. Something else that we've recently done is also worked with the Liberian Election Commission. They also had elections just at the end of last year on developing a guide for their poll workers, specifically targeting the unique barriers that women with disabilities encountered. So that was an issue that was raised both from the gender movement in the country as well as the disability community. I'd say, I'll leave it there, but just say the main sort of lesson learned, and I promised Michelle and I did not coordinate on this, is that you really need to coordinate with people with disabilities themselves. Same as here in the US, in other countries around the world, there are disability organizations everywhere. There's usually a national group, there's groups working at the sub-level, there's groups representing different types of disability, there's groups that represent all types of disabilities. There's no reason that we can't find people with disabilities to consult in the work that we're doing. And the last thing is I'll just make a quick plug. The US is looked at in terms of good practice examples. And the one thing that I do often hear is related to, we have not ratified the UN Disability Treaty. So it's been ratified by 90% of UN member states. There's a whole article related to participation in political and public life. So it's a bit difficult when I'm asked, well, the US hasn't ratified this treaty. Why should we change, our laws and policies to be inclusive if you haven't done it? So we do at least have the ADA, which the UN Disability Treaty is, quite frankly, many places copy and pasted from that to look at and use as a model. But having our international leadership in this space by ratifying that treaty would really be helpful.
Okay, great. I want to thank you all for being a part of this. I'm going to open it up for a couple of questions and have Brenda signal me when we are going to do audience questions. So first question that I have, basically in listening to some of the panels earlier today, they talked about how things are improving. And one of the ways that things are improving is the use of the internet. And I wanted to have each of you talk a little bit about how you feel that the internet can improve the process. We had heard a little bit about internet voting. I'm not talking more about that, but more of like voter registration, getting ballots out and things like that as well. So if you can just talk a little bit more about those sorts of things of using the internet to improve access to the ballot, I would appreciate that. So Cameron.
I think number one, the internet's been a fantastic tool. That's when you think of information and getting information, you're no longer thinking of print automatically or even, I remember gone are the days of getting an updated set of encyclopedias. It straight is to the internet. And whether you're looking for the closest restaurant or what a candidate might stand for, that's where you go. And so I think the use of the internet and sort of figuring out ways that, at least as an election administrator, we can interface with whatever information candidates might be putting out as a way to get it to voters, not necessarily advocating for it, but if there's somebody who has, let's say, registered as a candidate, the voters themselves have a clear way to know that they are registered as a candidate, they're a candidate, and how to get all the information about that person. So kind of taking those resources such as my customized news feed and really using it for the voters' advantages so that they understand what each candidate is saying as they're saying it real time in the news, I think is a huge benefit that can be done. But in terms of like right now, we've seen a lot of voter registrations since a couple years ago when we've opened up in Virginia with online voter registration, and it has helped tremendously. It also was kind of an unexpected surge because instead of having certain places where voters could register, it's now every place that voters can register. But now we've gotten over that hump. It's smoothed out the process quite a bit and automated it, and we've incorporated in things such as absentee ballot requests, and we've even incorporated the UOCAVA request into that process. And it's kind of interesting thinking of these different processes and looking at it as an electronic process, and it goes through question by question. Because you understand that it's going to ultimately wind up in what you think of as a standard type of form, but it's asking it in completely sort of user-friendly ways. And that's, as an election administrator, that's been really interesting to kind of watch and play around with, is see what the voter's experience is as opposed to, let me get this standard custom form, which you'll need to have notarized and then do this and do that, where it is just like sort of the TurboTax style method where it's simple questions going through just yes or no, or does this apply to you or not, instead of really needing, a manual to understand what that is. So, I think that alone has been a huge help in the last few years, and as more and more states come online with online registration, that it's going to help election administrators down the road because it really puts instantaneously the ability for voters and just about anybody to access the registration piece. And more importantly, and I think it's more towards the futures but voters themselves who might have some sort of disability in terms of visual disability, that they might have the tools built in to allow them to navigate those questions on the screens of their registration process. But I think, again, looking towards the future is that we need to make sure that whatever is offered out there as an official piece is done so with an eye on the disability community so that it is fully interactive and not just I can move and click and do this. So, increasing registration, possibly increasing the accuracy. Hopefully at some point in the future we'll get to the point where it's I have moved and filled out my change of address or done this, and it just automatically pops up and says, hey, want to go through this again?
I wish we could have had 10 other groups on this panel. It's just that important because you're saying things that are popping in my head are things like talking to the manufacturers, talking about using your own device to cast your ballot, having that scanned in and being able to print that out and moving forward with that as well. So, so there's so many other aspects that I would love to cover with this panel, but we just don't have enough time. But Stafford, any?
So this may seem trite when I say this, but the internet obviously is, the great equalizer. It's provided access to everyone who has an internet connection anywhere in the world. Information that, if you go to www.usvotefoundation.org, you will find the information that voters need to access their ballot or register to vote in their state or jurisdiction or residence. And that the internet has allowed individuals to use their smartphones, laptops or iPads or anything that they use to access the internet. They can get what they need and get what they're looking for. Now, obviously, there's a dark side of the internet, as we all know, that sometimes there's misinformation out there or there's disinformation out there, and that we have to be careful about what we read and what we process and how we ingest that information. I think it was Charles Stewart that said on the panel earlier that when we get data, we have to be mindful of what that data is telling us and what it means and how we process that information that we get. The same is true for understanding, when your voter registration deadlines are, when your election dates are, when the deadline is for you to submit your absentee ballot request. This is information that U.S. Vote Foundation collects and harnesses and puts it in one place. So anyone who has any inkling, understanding of when is my next vote, when do I elect my next county clerk, or when do I elect my next, sheriff, or when do I elect my next, senator from my state, or from my, territory, or my representative from my territory. That has what the information age has brought us. That's what the information internet has brought us to make things more accessible. As I mentioned earlier, 2004, the Overseas Vote Foundation at the time was first to automate the FWAB, Federal Write-in Absentee Ballot, online, shifting away from paper. As you've seen that the transition from the old ways of accounting for voter registration absentee ballots shifted online. So that's one example of how the internet has become the great equalizer in making sure that we don't have that citizens who are living overseas, in our case, don't have to fill out a piece of paper and mail it back and wait for the time lag to get back to you and then send it back. You can easily get it quickly within 30 seconds of determining your state of residence, the location, and getting the forms to process your voter registration application, and getting your absentee ballot request and send it in to your local election official.
Okay, Michelle?
I think Cameron gave an A+ answer to that question, actually. I think that technology is drastically changing the lives of people with disabilities, and it's making things infinitely more accessible than they've ever been. And we have to leverage that. I think people being able to register to vote online is amazing. I think electronic ballot delivery is amazing. I know we're not ready for online voting, but we can deliver a blank ballot electronically, and someone can tap in to the technology that they have at home to be able to access it and complete it. And that is a game changer for people with disabilities, with the caveat that it has to be done in a way that's accessible. I get to use my insider knowledge now. Those websites should be WCAG 2.0 AA compliant. That's a web accessibility standard. So, go me. I have my own little tech jargon. And they're not always. Those types of things need to be happening. We need to be talking to people with disabilities about what actually works for you. But I think that it is changing the way people with disabilities and people who are overseas are interacting with the election process, and I think it's going to change it for all voters eventually. I think that's coming, whether or not we feel ready for it. So we need to be, and we need to be ready to make it secure and accessible simultaneously.
Virginia?
Yeah, two things. One is the internet can now be used so that voters with disabilities can look up on, hopefully, their election commission's website and see if their polling station is accessible. This is something that the Election Commission in Saskatchewan in Canada does. So a voter can go online, their website is fully accessible, no matter what type of disability you have, and you can see if your polling station is accessible. If it's not, it'll tell you what the issue is. Is the issue that it's physically accessible for you to get into the building, but once you get in, there's not an accessible toilet, or whatever the issue is, so that you can make a determination like, okay, this is fine for me or this is not fine for me. And then it doesn't just stop there. It also then says, okay, so your polling station where you're registered to vote is not accessible. It gives you the option to go to the centralized hubs. So they have hub polling stations that are always fully accessible. So if you want, you can say, okay, the place where I'm supposed to register to vote or supposed to go cast my ballot is not accessible. And you can online say you want to go to one of these hubs instead. Secondly, the other way that we're seeing the internet being used really effectively in terms of disability inclusion is voter education. So many people with disabilities, maybe they don't have, in the countries where we work, don't have a computer or a laptop, but most people have smartphones. And information being disseminated that way is much more accessible, both in terms of it comes right to you into the device that you're always using, but also it's much easier to make accessible in the sense of, you can have captions on your video if you're doing that. You can have an audio version of a poster that you've made. It's much easier to make the content of your message accessible through the internet.
One quick follow-up on, is much access, and, I think it has been beneficial. We always have to keep an eye on making sure that it's accurate. Because if we begin automating processes too much and we could find ourselves in situations where it might not be what the voter had actually anticipated to put on something. So if we get to the point of a ballot marking device or, at home or something, and it doesn't mark accurately for the voter, we have to be very well aware that while that's not an actual tabulator, that is something that goes to play into. And if that was a resource that was used for voters with a visual disability, then they will never have a way to actually possibly verify that that was the correct indication of their choice. So I think it's also really important, just as much as we want to get information and resources out there, that they are absolutely 100% correct and safe and secure.
Well, one of the things I would advocate for is making sure that people know about the EAC's website on eac.gov. We have links to each individual state's website so that they can get information on the best information for them to register the vote and other aspects of that as well, to funnel that down as well. Because I know there's large organizations that deal with that. There's even a term out there of, we don't go to the encyclopedia anymore, we Google it. So, in terms of trying to find out information, I would definitely recommend our own website to move forward with that as well. That being said, Cameron, we weren't able to, we were restricted on the, size of our panels, but, one of the big aspects that the EAC is focused in on through the leadership of all three commissioners has been language access. And so and we've held a couple of summits on language access, and you participated in it last summer as well. How can jurisdictions anticipate what they need to do to serve these voters with limited English proficiency?
So I think in terms of anticipating is that you need to look at data. Any data that you have available out there, while your jurisdiction may not have been included in the 2015 or 2016 community survey as being included for new language, if you go back and look at that data, you can see where your populations are at and where the nearest estimate is for those populations and those languages. I think that's really important because that's going to, in comparison to previous year's census and other surveys, will tell you what sort of trend you're on and most likely might see come 2020, or just generally what the need of your community is. One of the things that we were actually caught off guard with was the designation of Vietnamese. We have a much more active Korean community in Fairfax County, but the fact that the Vietnamese community was the one that triggered the threshold did catch us off guard. Fortunately, we were in a position that we decided that we could take on both those languages so that we could serve both of those communities. One, because we had to serve the Vietnamese community, but two, we knew we also had a community, and then looking at the data itself was just shy of the threshold. And so when we started going back and looking at some of the other localities in Virginia, we kind of pointed out to places that, hey, you might want to be on the lookout because 5 years from now you might trigger that threshold. And so I think that's one of the things that I don't want to necessarily say anticipating, but acknowledging that the data is there that could really help you make that determination. Is just using it and deciding if that's the trend that you're going on, because you might even see a lowering trend as you go back and look through some of the U.S. Census information. And then if you have any contacts with local groups that are advocating for these different language access to the ballot, see what the needs are on their end. You might not be required to put anything actually, such as do a bilingual ballot, but it might be beneficial to understand where exactly their biggest need is, because you can start recruiting bilingual election officers and putting them in those places where it might not be necessary to put one in every polling place, but in those polling places that actually need it.
Okay. In 1 minute, Michelle. We have a lot of election officials here. Mm-hmm. How can they work with organizations like yours? Because a lot of election officials are worried of being sued for information. So how can they work with groups like yours to increase access?
I think that, well, the good news is it's really easy because we're everywhere. And you don't have to know who the disability organizations are in your state or your locality. You can just ask me and I can connect you to them. And if you don't know me, you can just ask Tom, and Tom knows me, and then he'll connect you to me and I'll connect you to them. So it's easy to find us. I think that those fears, 99.9% of the time, are not well-founded. I think that lawsuits are time-consuming and expensive, and a last resort for organizations who have not been able to build partnerships with our elections officials. I think that if you invite disability advocacy organizations and people with disabilities in the door at the start of the process and you work collaboratively throughout, you're going to get a much better result. You can actually avoid things like lawsuits. Everyone loses, right? They're very costly, and at that point, voters have probably already been disenfranchised. I think it also, you know, it's one thing to go out and try to find enough accessible polling places, and you fail to, and then you brace yourself for disability advocacy organizations coming to you. Why not ask them to go with you and try to find, and maybe we'll have some good ideas and we'll help make it better, and if not, well, we both have to stand up together and say we tried, and this is just where we're at right now. That's a position I'd rather be in, and I think any election official would be as well. So I think that if you contact us and we start working together from the start, you actually avoid some unpleasantness that you're probably afraid of. The last thing I'd say is that if you know advocacy organizations that do like to sue, I would recommend leaning into that and seeing how you can make that work for you. I talked to a lot of elections officials who say, we tried to find accessible polling places. We went to schools and we went to nursing homes and places that you would think would be inaccessible nursing homes. It happens, right? And we know, I promise you, if you went out your door and found that a lot of places aren't complying with the ADA, imagine what it would be like if you used a wheelchair. We know that the ADA is not being well enforced. We know that there are a lack of accessible polling places. So now you can be sued for not having accessible polling places, or those places that are supposed to be complying with the ADA 365 days a year can be sued by those organizations if they know that that's happening. So why not build some strong relationships with those organizations that do that kind of enforcement via lawsuit, and let's see if we can make that work for us. And maybe next year when you need a polling place, it won't be accessible anymore because someone will have taught them a lesson about it. I won't say too much about that, but that's
Great. I don't know where the two mics are, so they're over here. So as they're working around for questions, one thing that I want the audience to take away from this is that one of my good friends, Doug Lewis, used to say, if you live long enough, you will suffer from, or you will not suffer from, I'm misquoting him, you will have a disability at some point in your life if you live long enough. So that's something to think of as we all age and get a little bit older to when we go to vote as well. So first question, I guess, is Jim Dixon.
I wanted to offer two solutions that build on something that Michelle just talked about. Here in the district, there are accessible schools, and the principals won't let the Board of Elections use the school. We're working with the city election office, just got a commitment from the mayor that starting next year, in-service teacher training days will coincide with Election Day. So there's no longer, and the schools will therefore be available. And that was done in a partnership with the disability community and the Board of Elections. I wanted to speak to the really annoying points that Michelle raised. The machine's not turned on. The poll worker doesn't know how to use it. It isn't plugged in. Again, Alice Miller here in DC came up with a simple and beautiful way to fix that problem. We all know it's very hard to train poll workers. And you've got to make them understand that something is important for them to get it. When you sign your name, you're asked, every voter, do you want to vote on the machine or do you want to vote by paper? About 20% of the public, sometimes higher, will choose to vote on the machine. If the poll workers know they have to ask every voter, do you want to vote on the machine, the poll workers are going to be darn sure they know how to turn the machine on. It doesn't cost any money, and it takes away all of those excuses, all of those problems, but makes it real clear to the poll worker They've got to know how to run the machine because they're going to ask everybody, do you want to use it?
Great, great. So we only have 5 minutes left, so any other questions, or I will start talking myself. Michelle.
Hi there. I wanted to ask this question of Michelle Bishop. With all the talk about accessible voting machines, and that's awesome, I was wondering if you had any comment or thought or had seen any observations about the accessibility of the voter check-in process. I work as an election judge in Travis County, for example, and there's still a big portion of that, and in other counties, that's not picking on my home county in any way, that has, manual, have to sign in. And even when you have curbside voting where you bring a voting unit out, you still have to do that, maybe show your ID or something, and make sure, verify that that's the person. And in my experience, that's a little bit inaccessible. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
That's such a good question. I think that technology could be changing that as well. We heard this morning there's been a huge rise in the use of e-poll books. I think that has the potential to make that process more accessible, but only if it's done well, and that's not particularly regulated. We have voting system guidelines that don't say anything about e-poll books, and I think that's a mistake. And I fought very hard to see that change, which we probably won't. I think that we need standards for that type of thing for a couple of reasons. One, the check-in process is not particularly accessible to voters, but something that I would hope would be more moving for our friends in the elections community is that I talk to a lot of elections officials who say they can never find enough poll workers. Well, the census tells me that 1 in 5 people have a disability, and Pew tells me that it's probably more like 1 in 4. So 1/4 of the population are people with disabilities, and everything all the tools that a poll worker needs to use are not accessible. So you can't find enough poll workers, but you've already instantly ruled out 1/4 of the population by making this a job that's not accessible for them. So that's probably a mistake. I think everything that's a part of the process that deals with the voter or the poll worker needs to be fully accessible. I think we need to start leveraging technology to do that, but I think we need to be talking about those technologies, and I think that we need to start to have some standards and guidelines for them and consider them part of the end-to-end process for the voter.
So we have time for one last question. Not seeing any hands, I'm going to talk. Well, on that note, I want to thank my panelists, but also put in a plug for people to serve as poll workers. I've had more than 30 years of experience working in elections now, and one of the things that I got my greatest knowledge from was actually serving as a poll worker in Fairfax County, by the way.
For people, so.
But as a public official, I don't know if I'm eligible anymore. But anyway, I would love to. I would say anyone in this room or across the nation to serve as a poll worker, because it's a very enlightening experience that gives you a lot of knowledge from the other aspect of it, of what it's like to be an election official for a little bit, for the day at least. With that, I believe I will turn this over to Brian Newby for the last panel of the day, the open mic discussion with my fellow commissioners. And Brian Newby, come on up. But again, I want to thank my panelists for participating today. I wish we could have had a little more discussion, but hopefully this is the first and not last time we will discuss these issues. Thank you.